How the hell did the Odin artifact get to the Dark Ether? A question that you might think is obvious, but I promise you, no one has yet come up with an answer to this riddle. The more you look into this, the crazier it gets, to the point where I feel like I've gone nearly insane trying to put this video together. What started off as a simple question connects the Terminus crew to Scarlet and Diego, Alistair Rhodes, the ancient Egyptians, Korifex himself, and even time travel. If that sounds unbelievable, stay tuned, and by the end of this video, you might just become as insane as well. Since the ending of Terminus, the main on-disc experience of Black Ops 6 Zombies, players have known that finding a Sentinel artifact was going to be one of the main goals of our cast in this part of the storyline, and this was all but confirmed with the ending of Citadelle Des Morts. Yet, with the release of the tomb, new specifics have come to light that have confused people about the exact nature of this artifact. Indeed, a recent surge of players on Twitter have been making really interesting theories all relating to the Sentinel artifact. In particular, an amazing thread was made by Jake or Salad Burgers on Twitter, coincidentally as it was making this. It's really great and makes so many interesting connections, and so credit to him for finding some information that's going to be featured in this video, particularly this piece of intel that I'd never seen before, which we'll get to later, and another thread by Stanley557 discussed a similar idea too. But I do think that this thread and a lot of the other brilliant discussions that have been happening have been missing one crucial aspect that could change everything. How did it even get there? First, let's get the basics out of the way. In the Chaos storyline, the 4 Sentinel artifacts were objects of immense power that stood literally as sentinels, guarding and protecting the knowledge of prima materia and the promise of the ability to harness and manipulate it, which could give someone godlike power to create or destroy as they saw fit. In order to gain this knowledge and the ability to manipulate the first matter, an individual would have to activate an artifact by placing the corresponding key, called the Mind by Alistair Rhodes, onto the artifact itself, which Rhodes called the Body, which would then cause the activation. This would indicate a Sentinel trial, changing the landscape around the artifact to whatever was needed to give the individuals involved a fighting chance to complete it. But if they were not worthy, they would fail. As a final note on this Chaos refresher, the first step of a Sentinel trial is always to approach the artifact, which is floating in a ghostly form, and activate it. Until the individual does this, it stays in its dormant, ghostly translucent blue form, just hovering. Now, what have we since learned about the Sentinel artifact in the tomb? Well, most importantly, we've gotten confirmation that this is the same artifact from the Chaos storyline, or to be more specific, this is one of the artifacts. Up until this point, due to Sam often referring to this as the Sentinel artifact, there was uncertainty as to whether or not Chaos in its entirety was canon with its 4 known distinct Sentinel artifacts. Some people had speculated that perhaps the writers had just taken the idea behind them, taken the design from the Odin artifact, probably the most well known as it's literally the first image that appears on Google if you search the term Sentinel artifact, and made this into a single artifact for this new Dark Ether narrative. Well, now thanks to the ending of the tomb, we know this is explicitly not the case, and despite the characters often only referring to this artifact in the singular, all 4 are distinct in canon. As we see in the ending cutscene as the Sam AI gets into Janice's mainframes, Rhodes File 2781, the 4 artifacts. Ancient writings identify 4 known Sentinel artifacts: the Odin artifact, Danu artifact, Ra artifact, and Zeus artifact. All share a common morphology and function, with surface details corresponding to the cultures where they first appeared. The commonalities from such far-flung sources suggest widespread early contacts with a dark dimension and a point of origin beyond the terrestrial realm. From this file, we can see that Alistair Rhodes himself, likely by the time of the Chaos storyline, believed that the 4 Sentinel artifacts had a point of origin in a different dimension, which explains how they are able to look so similar and share the same purpose, despite having come into the world during vastly different times and cultures. A radio in the Chaos story, obviously from an earlier point in time, shows that Alistair was only aware of 3 artifacts, so clearly this file 2781 is more recent in terms of his research. I will play that radio for you now.
To the best of my knowledge, there are 3 artifacts, each with their own companion key. My expeditions have brought me 2 keys. Now for the artifacts, then to complete the trials. But what of a reward? To what end do we pursue these avenues of horror? Well, my friend, that's when we reach that is our goal. The bastion, the greatest unknown, the unobtainable suddenly within our grasp. A discovery on this scale would be my legacy. No, it goes beyond my legacy. It would be a discovery unparalleled in the history of mankind. Imagine, pure, untapped. Too dangerous for mankind's hands. Yet in the right hands, in my hands, it can be used. It must be found, and I am the one to find it.
Another interesting note is that as well as the Odin artifact being highlighted in orange during this section of the cutscene, the Ra artifact is also highlighted. We then get text about the Ra artifact itself and a quote from the Liberty Falls cult leader Josiah Shem about using the Horned Key, possibly hinting that Shem somehow came to know of or possess the Ra artifact, but I digress. We then have this excerpt. Rhodes File 118 appear in historical records since Egypt's pre-dynastic period, and thus did Korifex render unto Amenhotep, the instrument of eternal renewal, and bid him feed its shards of tempest that the gates of Duat bend to his will. Song of Amenhotep, 4100 BCE. As mentioned, this file details an ancient depiction of the Ra artifact and clearly links to Korifex itself. Rhodes notes that this is from 4100 BC, firmly within Egypt's pre-dynastic period, the time before Upper and Lower Egypt united into one kingdom. For context, this period lasted till around 3100 BC, and the first pyramids were built in around 2600 BC. Why am I telling you this? Because Amenhotep, likely referring to the controversial pharaoh Akhenaten, didn't live until the 1300s BC, over 3000 years after this Song of Amenhotep is said to have been written. Is this a mistake on Treyarch's part? Did they just get the dates wrong? It's possible that this is just a mistake, but if we read the text itself, we see that it specifically details Korifex having the pharaoh feed the Ra artifact shards of tempest. Tempest being a Latin word for time, to power it and bend the gates of Duat, the ancient Egyptian afterlife, to his will. If the artifact is somehow powered by time itself, it is possible this could explain how a song about the artifact ended up 3000 years in the past from the event the song describes. Interesting stuff, you'll agree. But I'm sure you are now wondering about how a time-traveling Sentinel artifact relates to the question I asked you to think about a few minutes ago. How did the Odin artifact get to the Dark Ether Nexus? Well, now that you know all of the necessary context, we can discuss just that. We heard originally in Citadelle Des Morts that Alistair Rhodes had asked archaeologist Sir Archibald Fotherington Smythe to undertake an excavation in Avalon, where Alistair had allegedly tracked down the location of a Sentinel artifact, specifically the Odin artifact. Now, some players were thinking that this, perhaps, was an origin story for the Odin artifact, and how it got to the safe on the Titanic in Voyage of Despair. But that isn't true. In fact, from a hidden document in Voyage of Despair, seemingly written by Alistair sometime in 1911, we know that the Odin artifact's body, the bottom piece, was safely in the Natural History Museum in London, and explicitly without its key. As for that key, we learn in the Chaos comic issue number 2 that it had been kept safe by the family of Diego Nakali for centuries. Let me just repeat that. The key had been separate from the artifact for centuries. In the comic, Alistair befriends Diego and is given this key, which he eventually sends to Scarlet, and thus it ends up being used in the Voyage of Despair intro cutscene. So the key and the artifact, the mind and the body, are reunited for the first time in centuries, possibly longer, in 1912. So enough background and context. What is my actual point here? Well, remember that question I asked you to ponder. How did the Odin artifact get to the Dark Ether Nexus? Some of you might still be thinking, it's an easy question. Archibald took it and brought it to the Natural History Museum. Easy. This is the problem. That is impossible. In the tomb, when we first reach the broken bridge, we hear an echo of Archibald, getting to hear through time back to a moment in 1908 when the dig was occurring. Archibald sees the artifacts there, floating in the Dark Ether Nexus, just as we see it, in its ghostly blue form. However, before Archibald can get close, he is tricked by a mimic, eaten and spat out, with the monocle remaining in the mimic's stomach, with no one even entering the site until the Terminus crew did 80 years later. Now stay with me here. If Alistair Rhodes' research told him that the artifact was in the tomb in Avalon in 1908, but Archibald couldn't get to it and died, and no one else visited the Dark Ether Nexus until our characters did, how on earth could the artifact be in the museum in London, out in the world, ready to kick off the Chaos storyline? And to make matters even more confusing, the artifact in the Dark Ether is even complete and active with its key. Expanding on this further, Alistair says explicitly in another Voyage of Despair radio that an artifact without its key is about as good as paperweight, with it being able to do exactly nothing. I'll play that for you now.
There are always two, mind and the body, each made for the other. Lock and key. Without the mind, the body is but an artifact, a relic from an ancient civilization. Beautiful and priceless though it may be, it is utterly useless. Not unlike Pandora's box, the artifact cannot be opened without the proper key. Brute force accomplishes nothing. A hammer won't even leave a dent. It is completely impenetrable. But that is for protection, for he is sent on a journey, one that cannot be stopped once started. That is why they must have the key. They must open it by their own volition. They must wish to inflict peril upon themselves. After all, the artifact does not wish to be opened. It is protecting it. It is a guard, a sentinel.
It wouldn't even be able to do its floating thing that Archibald obviously sees it doing. So we can say with 100% certainty that the key is present here in the Odin artifact, and has been for a very long time, since before the Chaos story even began. Immediately then, we have to wonder, where did the Odin artifact in the Chaos story come from? Is it a second Odin artifact? Alistair Rhodes or the Order 100% did not acquire this one in the Dark Ether Nexus, and the one that actually initiates Voyage of Despair was separate from its key for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. Well, here's where the theory comes into play. Remember the ancient story we were given about the Ra artifact, and how it was seemingly written 3,000 years before the pharaoh it mentions was even born. Well, that could be a mistake, or it could be some sort of time travel. And this is something we've been talking about for a while. And given that story mentions the pharaoh, on the orders of Korifex himself, changed the artifact with shards of time, the shards of Tempest, I believe it is not a mistake, and that the Sentinel artifacts have an ability to move through time. Equally here, we have what, at face value, looks like a mistake. How could the Odin artifact have its key 4 years before it's ever meant to have its key, when they've been separated for centuries? It could be a plot hole, and if it was happening on its own, I'd agree that it is. But given in the same map we have a story about another one of the artifacts manipulating time, I believe that this artifact time travel. Let's look at what happens to the Odin artifact in Voyage of Despair. It's brought together with its key. It's charged up throughout the quest, and finally it is placed into Yggdrasil, the Norse tree that connects together the 9 realms, effectively all of existence, similar to, I guess, the concept of the ether. In fact, we place it into a slot perfectly shaped like the Sentinel artifact, despite a lot of people thinking the Chaos crew collected this artifact and brought it with them. That isn't true. And this event with Yggdrasil returning the artifact to where it was created is the last time they ever see it. This also rules out the other theory people have arrived at, where they think the Chaos crew put the artifact in the Dark Ether Nexus after the Chaos storyline concludes, that unfortunately we didn't get to see play out due to it being cancelled early after Ancient Evil. But this is just not possible. The next time we, as players, see it in the flesh is in the Dark Ether Nexus, undisturbed since Archibald saw it, with the artifact literally hovering upon what seems to be a purpose-built altar for it. If we look around the arena, we can notice some incredibly interesting details. At the far end of the arena, there is a spot where the final phase of the boss fight occurs. There is a circle that the Sentinel Artifact attempts to fly into, above a door. If we look closely at the door, we can see that it is a literal door to nowhere, as Archibald calls it, as there is nothing behind it. But looking closer, what do we see on it? The motif of a tree, looking an awfully lot like Yggdrasil. Indeed, if we look in the area far behind that door, we can see a lush forest, an area we can never get to. What does this all mean? Well, I think this is where the Odin Sentinel Artifact originated. This is its Yggdrasil. Making sense, it's a tree branching all creation, and a nexus is a central or focal point, a connection or series of connections linking two or more things, with Yggdrasil at the heart of it. The amulet is even described as the Dark Ether's heart. An interesting point to note here is that the Nordic-style arches within the Dark Ether Nexus, and particularly the boss fight arena, look remarkably like the pillars on the mound in Origins, aside from the very obvious homage to it in the form of the literal mound in the middle of the Nexus. These stones are generally considered to be of Norse and Celtic cultures, of which can be found in France in the real world, as recently shown by Cod Law Facts in a video he did. In fact, as shown in his video, the Danu Temple in 9, Danu being a Celtic goddess, actually features a large degree of these circles, possibly suggesting a cultural overlap between the Norse and Celtic cultures. A recent thread on Twitter highlighted a really interesting possibility relating to this, that the Templar/Keeper symbol that Primis wear, as well as the Templar Knights that defend the generators and Origins, could actually be a Sentinel artifact. Obviously, if this is the case, this would be a retcon, as I don't think anyone could actually believe that they had this idea for Sentinel artifacts all the way back in Origins, where the symbol first appeared. It was supposed to be a redesign of the Black Sun, as obviously originally the Ether story had ties to the Vril and the Vril Ya, which then went on to become what we know now as the Keepers. The Black Sun was a Nazi conspiracy theory, so that's why it looks awfully like that, and is what we now know is the Apothecon Sun we see in Revelations. I wonder if Treyarch could actually retcon it to try and get away from the Nazi origins, because obviously that is quite controversial, and they could instead say that they were Sentinel artifacts. Even so, as this was obviously never the initial intention, it would still be a really interesting narrative link, especially seeing as each staff would feasibly be linked to each Sentinel artifact. The Ice Staff to Odin, as we see on the tomb, the Fire Staff to Ra, Danu to the Wind Staff, and Zeus to the Lightning Staff. Again, this was all explored in a Twitter thread that I will show on screen. And there has even been a thread by Sub-Zero that could be linking the Dark Ether markings to none other than Nauticus from Vanguard Zombies, as well as Yggdrasil. However, these Dark Ether markings on Yggdrasil are Norse writing, which are not the Dark Ether symbols we see on the Ice Staff as well as Nauticus. Whilst yes, Nauticus's runes do look like Norse, they cannot be physically translated, unlike the Yggdrasil ones. But there could be a connection here, but let me know what you think. Could it even be possible that the mound in the Dark Ether Nexus and the mound in the real world crossed over during the Great War? I recently posted a video on the idea of the Great War not being a single point in time, but a big crossover of all of time. That'll link on screen and in the description. I would definitely recommend watching that after you are done with this one, and could we even see the Great War return in a new fashion in the future? If Treyarch do retcon this idea, as we know the original characters are returning with Black Ops 7, COD 2025, whatever it ends up being called, later this year, and is probably the climax for the game, we know that the Sentinel artifact is likely going to be what is used at the end of this storyline, as Richtofen wants to use it to try and reform his family with the infinite building materials of Prima Materia. Could it be then that it messes up with the Dark Ether realm, and the original characters' echoes or essence of their memories are summoned, as nothing is truly lost if the memory remains, as is written in the Tomb's ending cutscene, could then similarly be hold these markings, especially if the Sentinel Artifact is the very thing that is used at the end and could even be how they end up being summoned again. It's an interesting idea that they could be the Sentinels, the guards of the Dark Ether. But if Trek were to go with this retcon, it would mean that the Sentinel Artifacts would have had to always have existed inside of the Dark Ether since even back into the old Ether story, and could even played a role in the original Great War. I think this is unlikely. I'm not exactly sure if Trek are going to go with this retcon, but it's an idea I really like, and honestly it's just so crazy that I could see it happening. I mean, maybe Trek are not even planning on doing this, but they might have seen this theory and decide to run with it, because it could definitely work, and it would make them seem giga-chadded, mega-brained, like as if they've had this planned all along, when obviously they haven't. But that's how the storyline's always been written. It's been written in a fashion where it makes it seem like it's always been planned all along, when really they've always just ran with the fan ideas and the different evidence we've been discovering. Anyways, I believe that the Odin artifact, billions of years ago, was created in the Dark Ether Nexus by the Nine, which could likely be Dark Ether entities, given Korifex was the one to give the Ra artifact to the Egyptians. The artifact, incomplete with its body and key separate, was then given to humankind by the Nine, where it lay in the world for thousands of years. Eventually, it ended up in the museum in London, with Diego in Mexico having the key. I will also leave a link to my video on screen and in the description that I would highly recommend watching after you're done with this one, talking about all of the chaos connections on the tomb, as well as my ending cutscene breakdown. As I go more into this idea that the Nine now could actually be reinterpreted as being Dark Ether gods, and they create these artifacts in the realm, who then gave it to humanity, which then eventually led to the Cult of the Order. The parts of the Odin artifacts then were brought together upon the Titanic, and the completed artifact was returned to Yggdrasil. At this moment, the artifact was literally sent back through time, still completed, to the place it was made, the Dark Ether Nexus, where it sat upon its special altar, waiting for the Terminus crew or anyone else to claim it. The paradox explains not only how the Chaos storyline can be narratively relevant to the Dark Ether storyline, more so than it just being in the same world, but also clears up the potential plot hole of the artifact being in two places at once, with it actually just being returned to the place it was made upon its use. Does that mean that the Odin artifact will go back to the Dark Ether Nexus once again after the Terminus crew use it? What are these shards of time that are needed to power it, that we will likely find in Mansion, or at least in Janus Towers somewhere in Liberty Falls, and are probably what Sam was referring to as having prepared these elements for us there.
The artifact requires an infusion of exotic materials, unique elements that can only be harvested here at Liberty Falls.
As this is the first time that humans were able to complete a Sentinel trial in the Dark Ether, this is the first time we've seen people actually be able to collect an artifact. So what powers will it have at its disposal? Did Josiah Shem possess the Ra artifact? These are all questions that I will leave you with as we wait the exciting revelations in the Mansion. But it makes sense that the Sentinel artifacts have the ability to travel through time, as when a trial is activated, time exists in a bubble. As for example, after we complete the Voyage of Despair Easter egg, it's as if the Titanic never had a zombie outbreak. Time reverts back to the moment of its activation. All of the zombies revert back to humans, as if nothing ever happened, allowing these Sentinel artifacts to create zombie outbreaks and us to experience maps without affecting real-world history, which was a great concept they explored with Voyage of Despair, with the Titanic's crashing. Only those who participated in the trial would have ever known it actually happened. And we know that Richtofen is trying to distort time with Janus Towers and Mansion, and mess with the fabric of the Dark Ether. This probably all ties into the Sentinel artifact, but it seems that if the Nine truly were Dark Ether gods, potentially even some of them being the gods that we saw in Vanguard Zombies, or other gods that we haven't seen yet, it could play a crucial role in how the original characters return, as well as connections to the Shadow Smiths, as well as any other gods who may have made up the Nine. Will we ever find out who the Nine truly were, and who each one is tied with each artifact, and are there actually 9 artifacts out there in total? One link to each of the 9, similar to how we had the artifacts bonded with humanity and the Dark Ether entities in Vanguard Zombies. That's all for now. Lots of interesting stuff to discuss. We could be seeing a new Great War. Could the Sentinel artifacts' origins be on the very battlegrounds of said Great War? Could the artifacts have originated from the Dark Ether realm and Dark Ether gods? And could this even tie back into the original characters, as they now could be retconned as being the Sentinel Guardians of the universe, which is literally what the Keepers were. The Keepers were there to guard humanity and all of the other species and universes out there from the looming threat of corruption and the Apothicons. The Sentinel Artifacts are similarly meant to guard. Could the Keepers and their warriors that they assisted all be Sentinels? Let me know your thoughts down below, or do you think this is just too far-fetched for Trek to retcon this? I do agree it's far-fetched, but at the same time I see it, and there's been crazier, more far-fetched things that have happened in Zombies before, and Trek really do like to play around with these fan theories. So I think now that it's been brought up by the community, there is a good chance it could end up materializing, even if it was never initially intended. But anyways, thank you for watching the video. Make sure to subscribe if you're not here for latest and greatest Call of Duty news and information. So anyways, thank you for watching, and bye.